Good morning, subscribers, and welcome back. Today I'm moving on to the next component in the OCR A-Level Economics specification and plugging the gaps in the playlist. Today we are looking, as you can see, we are looking at producer surplus. And within the spec there are three key criteria which you need to know and obviously understand, be able to explain, etc. And they are as follows. Number one, explain with the aid of a diagram what is meant by producer surplus. So again, we're really just taking all of the definitions that we looked at yesterday with regard to consumer surplus and now applying them to producer surplus. So explain is our key directive word here, and of course that means really just to sort of no more really than scratch the surface understanding and explanation. And obviously we're looking at producer surplus all the time. Secondly, explain and calculate how a change in price affects producer surplus. So again, scratch the surface, calculate. I'm not going to go into the calculate here at this stage, but obviously that's teeing you up for a question really, a multiple choice paper more than some type of essay question. And then thirdly, the directive word evaluate the impact of changes in price on producer surplus. Now, of course, as you know, evaluate means essay-style question. I would be very, very surprised if you got an essay in isolation which simply asks you to discuss or write an essay about producer surplus. That would be very difficult to do for a sort of 25-mark question. But of course, it may come within the components of a larger question where you're maybe looking at changes in demand and supply in particular markets. That could be housing or transport or commodities. It could come in the form of a question on market structures and competition, because of course that whole notion of producer and consumer welfare is really at the fore in a lot of that analysis. And it could also come in the form of the trade diagrams that you've got to do, particularly for tariff diagrams and quota diagrams, voluntary export restraint diagrams, again where you're often looking at changes in price and how that affects the various economic agents, particularly the consumer in the form of price and consumer surplus, and the producer in the form of price and producer surplus. Okay, so I'm not really going to go into the evaluate section a lot, but we'll go through the others first. We'll get to evaluate on those later essays. So first thing is first, you'll obviously need to be in a position to define and explain what we mean by producer surplus. So we're looking here at supply, first of all, because of course supply is to do with producers and firms, and the surplus is to do with the amount of revenue that the supplier receives for bringing a particular good to market. Now, if you have done labour market theory, you will know that the supply curve, if it was, say, the supply curve of labour, for example, that shows the minimum payment required to bring that particular factor of production, labour, into the labour market. And we can make the same sort of assumption and discussion here also. So, in order to bring, let's say, that unit of the good or service into the market, how much does the firm, the producer, need to receive in payment? Well, obviously they would need to receive this price. However, if you're at equilibrium point, let's say, and we've got a demand curve here and it's P star, Q star, then the supplier is actually receiving P star, but actually, in order to bring that, let's say, first unit into the marketplace, they would only need to be receiving P. And so, of course, that distance, that gap, is a surplus payment to the firm. And we can see that the whole way along the supply curve. So that's the payment required, that's the surplus. And so I'm sure you get the gist by now that the producer surplus is the payment received by the producer or the firm over and above the minimum required to bring the good or service to the marketplace. And we could obviously shade that entire sort of triangle area there, and that would be your producer surplus. So it's the area above supply and below the price. That's the great way to learn it. I always tell my students that. Just remember that producer surplus, PS, is always the area above the supply curve and below the price. And if you remember that, it's very unlikely that you'll go too far wrong in identifying the correct changes in producer surplus. Okay, so what about this next one? How a change in price affects producer surplus. So I'll just illustrate this on this diagram. I suppose the thing to say here is that when we don't have a demand curve on the diagram, it's much easier to see. So you might want to practice just adding demand curves and shifting demand alongside of supply just to make sure that you can clearly see where the producer surplus is. So if we were at price P1 and quantity Q1, then obviously this particular little triangle here, above supply and below the price, that would be the producer surplus. As price rises, you've got to sort of think about this and think about the changes going on. As price rises, who's being made worse off? The consumer. So if the consumer's being made worse off, more than likely the producer's being made better off. And we can see that because at P2, Q2, now the area of producer surplus is not only this blue hashed area, but this additional red hashed area. And so it is the changes in price, normally in an upwards direction from the point of view of the firm and the producer, which bring about benefits to the producer. Now, as I've said previously, what you might want to do, just by way of practicing your diagrams, is just add some demand curves to these as well. So if we had a demand curve, not very well drawn demand curve, that was it. So we've had a demand curve running through that equilibrium point as D1, and then you were shifting it to D2, just the mere fact that you've got another curve on there starts to make it a little bit more difficult to identify the changes. So the areas are still the same, but when you've got other lines passing through them, it's slightly more difficult to identify. So I would encourage you to sort of have a little play around with that and make sure that you can identify the changes, because I mean that's what you're being asked to do here in the specification. Make sure you can identify the changes when the curves are shifting. Okay folks, going to leave it at that. Bye for now.